I noticed that more cruisers than ever are staying on board their cruise ship rather than getting off in ports to self-explore or go on excursions. With many changes in both ports and on ships in recent years, I too have started remaining on board in more ports than ever before. There were even 2 cruises in the last year where I did not get off the ship in any port at all. So what is going on, and why and when should you also make the smart choice to stay on board in port? Welcome aboard, I'm Gary Bembridge, and here's what I think, starting with 4 port-related factors that affect my decisions. I never assume that just because my cruise ship is calling somewhere that the port itself is actually safe. In recent years, some ports have become less safe as tourism has grown and related crime has too, with affluent passengers visiting these ports often seen as easy targets. Every time I go on a cruise now, particularly if places I haven't been to, I check the latest travel advice on the UK Foreign Office site, which is easy to do by typing the port or country name and FCO into Google. In the United States, the State Department offers that advice to USA cruises too. For example, on a recent Caribbean cruise, I discovered that Cozumel, that I usually am very comfortable with and always feel safe in, had a raised warning because there'd been some gang-related murders and safety problems near the port. There is cautionary advice about high-risk crime at the time of recording in the Caribbean for places like Jamaica, Bahamas, Honduras, and Belize. While across in the Mediterranean, there are warnings about pickpocketing and muggings in cities like Barcelona, Rome, Venice, Athens, Florence, and Pisa. So I tend to stay on board if I think the port is dangerous, risky, or there's warnings, for example, about uncomfortable harassment of cruisers by locals. Another reason I often stay on board is in ports that have little to offer without a lot of cost and a lot of time to get to the sites. With more and even bigger cruise ships, they increasingly dock far away from the town centre in industrial and container working ports. I can't just step off in a picturesque town and go exploring. For example, on a Western Mediterranean cruise calling into Marseille, when I went there on a big ship, Norwegian Viva, we were miles out in a busy working port. As I would have had to line up and wait for a 30 to 40 minute shuttle bus into and back from town, I avoided all that hassle and stayed on board and enjoyed the large ship. However, when I then went there on Azamara Quest, being a small ship, we docked right in the city centre so I could step off and explore the cathedral, the castle, the marina, which were all within a short walking distance. So here's my top tip when planning to see if a port will be worth staying on board. I use what'sinport.com as that tells me exactly where cruise ships dock by port, if it's an industrial port, and if sites are close by or not. It also saved me, for example, from an unpleasant day staying on board on a recent Silversea South African cruise. It told me Richards Bay Port was industrial and had nowhere close by to walk to, but it also warned me that it was a port that loaded coal onto freighters and visiting ships get covered in coal dust, and so sitting by the pool out on deck was a no-go. So I knew to book an excursion and not to stay on board. I often choose to stay on board if the port is a long way from the sites worth seeing and will cost a lot of money, time or hassle to get to, and especially of course if I've been to them before. Now these ports are pretty common in Europe and Asia. For example, ports like Le Havre are up to 2 hours from Paris. Livorno can be 1.5 hours to Florence. Civitavecchia about that to Rome. La Spezia about the same to get to Cinque Terre, and so on. Now my top tip is if your itinerary has the name of a famous city like, say, Florence, but in brackets after it has another name like, say, Livorno, or say it has Venice with either Ravenna or Trieste after it, that means the ship is docked far away, and so a costly 7 to 10 hour excursion is often needed to see these places. But even if the sites are close to the ship, there's another time I decide to stay on board. And this is if I know that the ports are going to be overwhelmed and packed, making getting off way less appealing. With the numbers of ships, especially mega ships, calling on the same ports, as only some can handle them, these days many ports are extremely busy and crowded, especially in the Caribbean and the Mediterranean, and in places like, say, the Greek islands, Barcelona, La Palma, and so on. My tip is I check my itinerary on the website cruisetimetables.com because that tells me how many ships and which ships will be in that port at the same time. If there's a port with many large ships, meaning 15,000 or more cruisers will be crowding the town and sites, I plan to stay on board often. Let me give you an example. I did 2 back-to-back Caribbean cruises earlier in the year. One was on the circa 6,000 passenger Symphony of the Seas, followed by the 1,200 passenger Oceania Vista, both calling into Nassau in the Bahamas. Now, after looking at cruisetimetables.com, I actually made plans to get off on the Symphony of the Sea stop because there would be only 2 other relatively small ships in town. But when I was there on Oceania Vista, I could see there would be 5 mega ships in, and so many thousands of cruise passengers packing out the town, the beaches and the sites. There is a fast emerging development in some cruise ports now that I factor into my decision to stay on board or not as well. And that's ports where the locals do not welcome or don't want us as visitors. There is actually a growing trend, more so in Europe, of some hostility and protests towards tourist and cruise passengers, including cities like Barcelona, Venice, Seville, Palma, and in parts of Norway. For example, in Barcelona, locals sprayed visitors recently with water guns while they were eating out on the Ramblas, which is near the cruise terminals. In parts of Norway, like Stavanger and Bergen, there were stickers and posters up saying cruise passengers were not welcome this past season. So if I find that there's going to be protests growing or there's protests expected, I consider using that as a day to stay on board. Many of these reasons for staying on board in port are new and emerging developments, but now I want to move from portside factors to ship-led reasons for me staying on board when in port. I often stay on board these days to get the greatest value from those ever more costly packages or add-ons that I've bought. These can add a lot to my cruise costs, so of course I want to get my money's worth. Let me give you a couple of examples. When on Holland America, I like to book one of their retreat cabanas on warm weather cruises. They're in a secluded area with a private covered space with lounges, and I can order and have drinks and lunch served there. But they must be booked for the entire cruise. It cost me, for example, over $400 on a recent 7-night Mexico cruise on the Koningsdam. As it was even quieter when people were off exploring, we decided to stay on in port days to use it and get great value from that purchase. On a recent Cunard Queen Anne Canary Islands cruise, we'd bought a costly 2-week pass for the thermal suite. So on some port days, we spent time hanging around the even quieter than usual thermal suite to get, of course, more of our money's worth. Of course, these days, cruise lines encourage us to buy various packages and add-ons, ranging from drinks and Wi-Fi packages to ones that bundle things like drinks, Wi-Fi gratuities, and speciality or casual dining, like Celebrity Always Included, Holland America Have It All, Princess Plus and Princess Premier, and Norwegian Free at Sea. The advantage of staying on board in port is not only you can get reservations for things like the dining easier for daytimes, but also you can make the most of these packages. For example, if you've got a drinks package and you're out in port most days, you're not getting your value and money's worth from it. Now, not that I'm advocating that you should be drinking loads, but even I get more from my soft drinks package because I don't drink alcohol, but I get more coffees, juices, mocktails and sodas, of course, by staying on board. Plus, of course, if you're out in port, even on many cruise line private islands, drink and food is often going to cost you, but if you're staying on board, your food is included, as are drinks if you have that drinks package. Although Wi-Fi has become much better with the rollout of Starlink, the most affordable packages often don't usually include streaming. But I do find though that I get much better bandwidth and speed when, of course, most passengers are out in port. But staying on board can also help control cruise costs too. And there's 2 key things that I want to talk about, one of which is I love staying on board because I can take advantage of port day deals. I really enjoy having a massage, but personally I find cruise prices so expensive, but every line always has deals in the spa and port days, plus I can get appointments at times that suit me the best. Specialty dining is also usually cheaper at lunchtime than for dinner on most ships, so I can try specialty dining for less by staying on board. Also, it means avoiding the costs of excursions by staying on board some days. Excursions can easily add hundreds of dollars a day to any cruise. Of course, one of the key reasons for staying on board is to enjoy the ship and make the ship the destination itself. On many cruises, the main reason I stay on board is to get time to try and do everything and use venues like the pools, hot tubs, gym, and even buffet for lunch without crowds or lines. This is especially appealing if there are ports I've been to before. Now, those two cruises I mentioned at the start where I never got off the ship at all were both mega resort style ships where I saw the ship as my destination more so than the ports. One was a 7-night Royal Caribbean Symphony of the Seas Western Mediterranean cruise, and the other a 10-night Norwegian Viva cruise from Rome to Lisbon. There was so much to do on both, and I just couldn't get to do it all on the limited sea days, especially with the lines of people who'd been out in ports, now of course trying to pack everything in as well. So on Symphony of the Seas, I was able to do the water slides on repeat with no waiting. I could try the flow rider without lots of people watching me stumbling and falling off and embarrassing myself. I could try the monster slide, try all the different dining venues, which would be impossible to do if I was focusing just on doing them at night and on the limited sea days. I could do the trivia shows when people are out, of course, because that gave me a greater chance of winning because it wasn't so busy. On Viva, I did the same, like the go-karts, the water slide ride, and even went to the afternoon tea thing they did without all the crowds on sea days. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that there are ports that are increasingly more dangerous to go to currently. Join me over in this video where I talk about them in much more detail, but more importantly, what you should do if you get off in any of those ports. See you over there.